She looked at me like I didn't belong at the party I paid for. Eleanor tightened her grip around the lukewarm teacup, her knuckles whitening as she watched Olivia glide across the lawn, her ivory dress trailing behind her like a whisper of frost. The lace detail on the hem so familiar stung Eleanor's eyes. It was from her own wedding gown, preserved for decades and passed down. But Olivia had never mentioned using it, and she hadn't thanked her. In fact, she hadn't looked at her once all day. Eleanor remembered what her late husband once told her during a stormy evening when money had grown scarce and tempers had grown short. "Don't let anyone put a price on your kindness." It had comforted her then. It felt like a warning now. The garden was lively twinkling lights strung over bare trees, soft jazz, humming through the chilly air servers weaving between guests with crystal flutes of champagne. But Eleanor felt like a ghost among the living. Her seat was at the furthest table near the outdoor heaters that didn't quite work behind a pillar wrapped in pine garland. People smiled at her politely briefly, then turned their bodies away. It was after all Olivia's day. Her daughter had always been a little distant, sharp poised a mirror of her father's ambition. But lately, since Brian came into the picture, her edges had turned colder, more metallic. Eleanor tried to embrace Brian, to welcome him. She hosted the engagement party, paid for most of the wedding, even offered to cover Olivia's honeymoon. But the more she gave, the further Olivia drifted. And now, here she was, uninvited in spirit, if not in name. Across the lawn, Eleanor spotted Brian shaking hands with someone behind a column. As she leaned forward, she realized it was Greg, her lawyer, the only one who knew about the inheritance from Richard, her late husband. Brian's hand landed familiarly on Greg's shoulder, his voice too smooth for a new son-in-law. Olivia passed by the pair, her eyes meeting them briefly, but she kept walking. Eleanor's heart pounded. When Greg approached her 10 minutes later, there was a flicker of discomfort in his expression. "Eleanor," he said, "can we speak for a moment?" She nodded, rising from her uncomfortable seat. As they walked toward the edge of the garden, past a cluster of wedding guests engrossed in a toast, she noticed a folded document sticking out from Greg's coat pocket. Her name was printed at the top. She didn't need to see more. Greg hesitated, then handed her the paper. "Brian wanted me to have you look this over," he said, eyes darting. Eleanor opened the document. It was titled Post-Marital Asset Transfer Support Agreement. A series of cold, mechanical paragraphs outlined her voluntary intent to transfer a portion of her late husband's inheritance, $7 million, into a joint marital trust benefiting Olivia and Brian. Her hands trembled. There was no preamble, no discussion, no gratitude. Just a demand disguised as a formality. Brian appeared behind her, then grinning. "It's a simple formality, Eleanor. You've always wanted Olivia to have a secure future. This ensures that. You don't need to read all the fine print." She looked at him. Really looked. The boyish charm, the polished tone, the eyes that watched her too closely calculating. "And you think this is how it's done?" she asked quietly. During the wedding party, Brian smiled wider, as if charm could replace shame. "There's a notary here already. It'll take 2 minutes." Eleanor folded the paper slowly. "I don't sign anything under pressure," she said, then stepped closer to him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I've seen enough." Brian blinked, confused by her sudden stillness. He said something else, she didn't hear it. Her fingers brushed the edge of the lace on Olivia's dress as the bride passed once more, laughing with someone Eleanor didn't recognize. And still, she didn't turn to look at her mother. Not all gifts are announced. Some are buried in silence. The kitchen clock ticked in rhythm, with the wind brushing against the frosted windows. Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table, the house dim except for the amber pool of light cast from the pendant above. In front of her sat an old cedar box, worn at the corners, its lock long broken. Her hand cupped a porcelain teacup, the same one she'd had since her wedding. A small crack ran along its rim, barely visible, but she could feel it when she sipped. The crack hadn't been there before Richard died. She reached into the box and pulled out a folded letter, creased and softened by time. The handwriting was unmistakably his, slanted, deliberate, with ink that faded slightly near the end. Eleanor had read the letter many times since his passing, but tonight the words felt heavier. Elle, if you're reading this, I trust you're still the steady one. I left you more than they know, because I trust your heart more than I trust their judgment. Don't announce it. Not yet. Let time reveal who they are. She folded the letter back into the box, her fingertips lingering on the signature Richard. The day he passed, Greg, Richard's long-trusted lawyer, had met her at the hospice and explained the logistics. The $7 million had been kept in a legacy trust, discreetly handed to Eleanor through layers of documentation, with clauses that prevented public record for a designated period. It was Richard's last act of love and protection, and now it had become a weapon. Her phone buzzed. A new voicemail. Brian's voice filled the kitchen, smooth, but with a practiced edge. "Hi, Eleanor. I think we got off on the wrong foot at the wedding. Let's have a private conversation. Just you and me. I think we should clarify who really controls Olivia's future." She paused the message halfway through, deleting it without listening to the rest. Her fingers tightened around the teacup. She heard the faintest click, the porcelain responding to the pressure. That crack again. She remembered what Greg told her just a few hours ago. He'd dropped by after the wedding to apologize and clarify something. The account's untouched, he'd said, still under your name, just like Richard intended. But he'd hesitated. Greg never hesitated. There was a recent inquiry. He continued a formal request to access the legacy account. It was filed under a shared marital provision clause, something Brian cited in a separate document. "I've never seen it before. It's suspicious." Eleanor had raised an eyebrow. "Can they touch it?" "Not without your signature," Greg assured her. "But the attempt itself, it means someone is testing the waters." Her phone buzzed again. This time a text from Olivia. "You are being selfish to hide such a big thing from me and Brian. He's just trying to secure our future. Can't you support that?" The words felt colder than the winter wind sneaking through the kitchen window. Selfish. She had given Olivia everything, time, money, sacrifices she never spoke of. And now this, a child, siding with a man she barely knew against the mother who had always stood quietly behind her. The house creaked as the heater kicked in. Eleanor poured the rest of her tea down the sink. The teacup landed in the drying rack with a faint clink, a sound that echoed too loudly in the silence. Just then, her phone rang again. Greg. His voice came through low and tense. "Eleanor, I checked something after I left. There's more." She stood still, the receiver pressed against her ear. If someone's trying to transfer the assets without proper authorization, then maybe this isn't just a mistake. Maybe you and your mother are being framed. Eleanor didn't respond at first. Her eyes moved slowly toward the darkened hallway, where a photo of her and Olivia still hung, one of the last pictures, where they smiled the same way. She didn't yell. She just stopped asking me how I slept. Rain traced long, trembling lines down the kitchen window as Eleanor stirred her tea absent-mindedly. The television in the living room played a morning show no one was watching, casting soft flickers across the hardwood floor. Silence hung between the walls like fog, thick, quiet, and telling. Olivia had come home the day before, but not in the way daughters usually return after a wedding. No soft greetings, no recounting honeymoon plans. just questions about transfer processes and property titles. She'd barely touched her coffee. She hadn't asked how Eleanor slept. She always used to. Eleanor had memorized the pattern of affection, small talk, warmth, a kiss on the cheek. This version of Olivia was too still, too practiced. And when she left the kitchen that morning, she didn't even glance back. Eleanor sat at her desk, her hand hovering over the worn oak drawer. She pulled it open slowly, revealing a small voice recorder she'd bought years ago to document her memories before the idea seemed too indulgent. She clicked it on and tucked it discreetly behind a row of books in the home office. She didn't want to suspect her daughter. But something wasn't right. The rain intensified, tapping like whispers across the roof. Her phone buzzed Greg. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. "I followed up on your account access logs." She leaned in her voice, barely above a whisper. "And there was a login 2 nights ago from an IP registered in Brian's name. Not in your town. It's circumstantial, but unusual. Did you access your account then?" "No," she said. "I was here. Alone." The silence on the line was longer than usual. Greg finally asked, "Would you like to change the access protocols?" "Yes," Eleanor said, but quietly. Before she could hang up, the front door creaked. Olivia walked in, hair damp from the rain, an umbrella dripping onto the welcome mat. She didn't remove her shoes. She walked straight into the kitchen as if rehearsing a part. "I spoke to Brian," Olivia said. "He thinks it's time we handled the estate formally. The house, the accounts. We're not asking for everything, Mom. Just what's fair." Eleanor didn't answer. She placed the porcelain teacup down with care and looked out the window. "Is this how fairness looks to you now?" Olivia didn't reply. She turned and left the kitchen without touching the tea Eleanor had prepared. That evening, as dusk settled in and the house dimmed again, a soft knock interrupted the stillness. Bethany, 5 years old, pigtails and bright eyes, stood at the doorway, holding something in both hands. "I found this," she said shyly. "It's pretty. Do you remember the lace scarf my mum threw away?" Eleanor's breath caught. The scarf, white lace with hand-stitched roses, had belonged to her own mother. She had given it to Olivia years ago, and Olivia, during a closet purge, had deemed it too old-fashioned and tossed it into a donation box without a word. Eleanor knelt down. The scarf was clean, slightly wrinkled, but intact. Bethany had found it in one of the bags and kept it. She folded it gently, tears pricking her eyes not from sentiment, but from the quiet cruelty of erasure. Later that night, Eleanor reviewed her online banking portal. A new access attempt, not hers. She clicked the activity log unknown device logged in at 2:14 a.m. She pressed her fingers to her temple. The lace scarf lay folded beside her, soft and old, but enduring, much like herself. She dialed Greg. "If I want to protect my child from his own marriage," she said slowly, "what should I do?" She said I ruined her trust without asking why I kept the truth. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. Thin streams rolled down the kitchen windows, blurring the outside world into smudges of grey and green. The pale yellow light above the table flickered, once then held steady, but it wasn't enough to warm the room. Eleanor stood by the stove, waiting for the kettle to hum. The porcelain teacup sat on the table, waiting too, its familiar hairline crack now stretching just slightly farther than before. The lace handkerchief lay beside it, folded untouched. She heard the car door slam, then footsteps up the porch, quick and certain. Olivia didn't knock. She opened the door with the spare key and stepped inside, water still dripping from her coat. Eleanor didn't turn. "You really weren't going to tell me, were you?" Olivia's voice was quiet, sharp. $7 million. You hid it from me." The kettle began to hiss. I didn't hide it, Eleanor said softly. I waited. Your father and we wanted to see who you became before deciding how to share what we built. You don't trust me, Olivia snapped. That's what this is. You never believed I was strong enough to manage anything. You think I'd waste it, don't you? Eleanor turned off the stove and poured the water gently into the teapot. Her hands were steady, almost ritualistic. She didn't raise her voice. It wasn't about trust. It was about timing. Grief isn't measured in months, Olivia. You always treat me like a child, Olivia said, stepping closer. Her eyes were dry but glinting. You hold everything close, like you're the only one who understands how life works. You didn't even think I deserved to know. You're so bad. The words landed not like a slap, but like a quiet fracture deep spreading under the surface. Eleanor didn't speak. She set 2 teacups on the table, one for Olivia, one for herself. Olivia didn't sit. She stared at the lace handkerchief on the table, then looked away. Eleanor picked up her teacup, the same one she always used, and as her fingers curled around it, she felt a shift. A tiny sound. The crack had grown ever so slightly. She set it back down with care, as if acknowledging its fragility might keep it from breaking. I just wanted to be part of the plan, Olivia said, quieter now. Not someone you had to protect from it. Eleanor looked at her daughter for the first time since she walked in. I'm sorry you feel that way. That was all. No explanation. No defense. Only the rain and the low clink of porcelain. Olivia shook her head, pulled her coat tighter and left without touching her tea. The door closed softly behind her. Eleanor remained seated. She opened her small notebook, the one she kept for lists and old phone numbers, and on a fresh page, she wrote a single sentence. Sometimes people lose each other not because of betrayal, but because they don't understand. She closed the notebook and folded the lace handkerchief once more, placing it beneath the teacup like a cushion against what might crack next. Funny how the ones who preach transparency are the ones writing secret contracts. The clouds outside Greg's law office pressed low and heavy, turning the morning into a grey hush. Rain tapped softly on the old window panes, but inside the room was still. Books lined the shelves, faded spines, dog-eared files, and the smell of worn leather and coffee filled the air. Eleanor sat across from Greg, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. A manila folder lay open between them, exposing a document she couldn't look away from. Her name was printed at the top, in bold. Beneath it, a signature that mimicked hers, down to the curve of the E. But it wasn't hers. Greg tapped the corner of the page. This was scanned into a shared account registered under Olivia and Brian's names. A copy exists, yes, but not one you authorized. Eleanor didn't speak. Her eyes traced the lines of the forged signature again. There was something slightly off. The final loop of the E-yar didn't curve the way hers always did. But to an untrained eye, it was nearly flawless. They filed it as a conditional power of attorney, Greg continued. If not challenged, it could give them temporary access to certain funds under the pretense that you're transferring assets for estate simplification. Eleanor breathed slowly. They were going to ease me out while smiling in my face. Greg's legal secretary Meredith entered briefly to hand over a printed IP address log. She didn't stay long, just a nod and a murmured, "Here you go, ma'am," before vanishing behind the door again. Greg scanned the page. This matches the earlier login, the one from Brian's location. They've linked this contract to a financial trigger. If you don't act, they will. Eleanor leaned back, her spine straight, despite the weight of realization. I thought Olivia would ask questions first. She might believe Brian's doing this for their future, Greg said gently. or she might not want to see it clearly. Eleanor reached for the document again. Can you draft me a replica? Greg blinked. You mean, I want the same form, same language, everything. She paused, then added, but insert an asset protection clause, a clause that voids the contract if tampering or false representation is found. Greg hesitated. You're laying a trap. I'm giving them a choice, she said, her voice low. If they step in, they'll trip it themselves. The rain thickened now, streaking sideways across the window. Eleanor stood and walked to it, pushing aside the heavy curtain. Across the parking lot, a black SUV idled behind a tree. Even from this distance, she could recognize the sharp angles, the tinted windows, Brian's car. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave. Instead, she whispered more to herself than to Greg Good. He came at the right time. She handed me the old cloth like it was a treasure I'd forgotten. The late afternoon sun melted softly through the living room curtains, casting golden shadows across the floor. The faint scent of oatmeal cookies drifted from the kitchen, lingering like memory, warm, familiar, and fleeting. Eleanor stood by the window, arms folded, watching leaves swirl gently in the breeze beyond the glass. A knock at the door broke her reverie. When she opened it, Bethany stood there, her cheeks pink from the wind, her small hands gripping something tightly. She didn't speak right away. She just reached out and placed the bundle in Eleanor's hands. It was the lace scarf. Folded carefully, it smelled faintly of cedar and something older like time tucked into the corners of a drawer. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as they unfolded the delicate cloth. The thread was just as she remembered, soft ivory loops stitched by hand, every row carrying the quiet rhythm of the night she'd made it. Mommy told me to throw it away, Bethany said, her voice soft but steady. But I think you should keep it. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, then down at the scarf, her voice catching in her throat. Where did you find it, sweetheart? In the closet at home? In the stuff we don't need bag? Eleanor's eyes lingered on the intricate lace. She remembered the night she'd knit it, her wedding night. Nervous, hopeful. It wasn't expensive or flawless, but it was hers. It had survived time, love, death, and now neglect. Bethany sat cross-legged on the rug, nibbling on a cookie. Her hair shimmered in the slanted light. Are you sad that my mum won't wear it? She asked, crumbs resting on her lip. Eleanor sat beside her, holding the scarf gently on her lap. I'm not sad that it's not used, she said slowly. I'm sad that it's forgotten. Bethany nodded, as if that made perfect sense. They sat together for a while, not needing to fill the silence. The quiet between them was different than the silence Eleanor shared with Olivia. It wasn't heavy. It didn't carry judgment or absence. It was simply peaceful. Bethany tilted her head suddenly. Uncle Brian said, "Good people don't keep money for themselves." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at the scarf again, letting her fingers glide over the rows of loops and twists. Sometimes, she replied carefully, you have to learn to keep things even when no one thinks you should. Especially then. Bethany shrugged, more interested in the cookie crumbs on her sleeve. But I think you're good. Eleanor smiled, though it was a quiet smile, more relief than joy. After Bethany had been picked up, Eleanor stayed in the living room, her hands resting on her lap. The scarf lay across the table, and beside it she placed another object, a folded document, crisp and calculated. The fake contract. Greg had done a precise job. Every line mirrored the original. Every clause sat quietly until the protection clause tucked midway, subtle but explosive. Eleanor looked at the two items. One delicate, made with care. One forged, made with strategy. And yet both were tools. Both in their own ways were acts of preservation. She didn't need applause for her plan. She only needed clarity. The phone buzzed across the table, a voicemail from Olivia unread. Eleanor didn't reach for it. Instead, she leaned forward and refolded the scarf, laying the document beside it. One represented what had been dismissed. The other, what would soon be revealed. She invited me for dinner, but the seat at the table was missing. The sun dipped behind the trees as Eleanor stepped out of her car and walked up the path toward Olivia and Brian's home. The house, once hers, in part, now felt like a showroom version of a family's life. Fresh paint, manicured hedges, windows that glowed a little too brightly, like a smile stretched too far. Olivia greeted her at the door with a kiss on the cheek that barely grazed skin. "We're just finishing up the roast," she said. "Come in." Inside, the lights were cold, blue-white LEDs that flattened every shadow. The dining table was set for 6. Plates gleamed, cutlery aligned like soldiers. But when Eleanor stepped closer, she noticed something odd. 5 chairs. There was a folding chair leaning against the wall, and Olivia, without a word, pulled it forward and set it at the corner of the table. "I wasn't sure if you were coming," she said lightly. Eleanor smiled, even as her heart sank into itself. "I wouldn't miss it." Brian's voice carried from the kitchen. "Hope you brought your appetite, Eleanor. I'm opening a Bordeaux that's older than Bethany." He appeared moments later, holding 2 bottles and grinning broadly at his friends, already seated, and laughing at a story Eleanor had missed. No one stood to greet her. She was introduced as Olivia's mom, nothing more. She nodded politely. No one asked her a question. The meal began with clinks and shallow conversation. Brian dominated the talk, gesturing with his wineglass as he spun a tale about real estate and family consolidations. "You know," he said, turning to his guests, but clearly projecting toward Eleanor, "we've started an investment trust for Bethany's future. Properties already aligned under one vision. Makes everything simpler, especially when things are gifted instead of, contested." Eleanor took a slow sip of water. Olivia was quiet, focused on cutting her meat into tiny, perfect squares. "You've built something amazing," one of the guests said to Brian. Brian nodded, smiling like a man who'd just received an award. "It's all about forward thinking." After the plates were cleared, Brian returned with an envelope. "We'd like you to look over something," he said smoothly, placing the envelope beside Eleanor's plate. Olivia didn't look up. "It's a gesture," he added. "A formalization of what we talked about, just paperwork, to make the gift official. Tidy things up." Eleanor opened the envelope. Inside, a newly printed contract, carefully worded, sweetened with phrases like family unity and future planning. She didn't flinch. She closed the envelope with calm hands and looked up, her smile soft, controlled. "I think we should let Greg see it first." The room froze. Forks paused mid-air. One of the guests coughed. Brian blinked, once his smile dimming just enough to show the crack beneath. "Of course," he said quickly, "if that makes you feel more comfortable." The dinner continued, but something had shifted. After dessert, Bethany found Eleanor by the coat rack, holding her little pink backpack and a half-eaten cookie. She reached into Eleanor's purse and, with small, careful hands, folded the lace scarf neatly and tucked it inside. "Mommy said you brought too much drama tonight," Bethany whispered. "But I think the scarf is lucky." Eleanor bent slightly, brushing hair away from Bethany's face. "Thank you for keeping it safe." Bethany looked up. "Does it bother you that you're called trouble?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "No," she said gently. "Sometimes trouble is just another word for someone who doesn't stay quiet. It was meant to be a memory, but it became evidence." The rain drummed steadily on the rooftop, echoing like soft knocks from the sky. Eleanor stepped into Greg's law office, shaking droplets from her umbrella, her coat clinging damply to her shoulders. The warmth inside was faint, more from the hum of old heaters than from the dim yellow desk lamp that glowed behind Greg's stack of papers. She carried a small hard drive wrapped in a tea towel. I found it behind a drawer. It's the original footage from the wedding. Greg looked up, his expression unreadable. You're just in time. The editor called me this morning. He gestured for her to sit already, queuing up the video file on his laptop. The loading bar crept across the screen as thunder rolled far above them, deep and long, like a warning. The video began innocuously, chatter, laughter, the usual glamour of a well-funded wedding. Eleanor recognized the table centerpieces she had chosen, the way Bethany clung to her lace dress in the background. Then came a quieter moment, one not meant for the camera. A side angle, perhaps taken during a lull in the event. Brian stood slightly apart from the guests, his champagne glass lazily tipping in one hand. Next to him, a man in a navy blazer. Eleanor didn't recognize him. Their voices captured faintly, but clearly floated through the speakers. She has no clue, Brian said with a chuckle. Once my wife signed her mother's just a placeholder. It'll all cycle through us eventually. The man laughed. You really going to let her keep the deed that long? Brian's grin tightened. I give it 6 months? Maybe less. Greg paused the video. The rain ticked more insistently on the windows. He said it, Eleanor murmured. He did, Greg replied. And it's admissible he was speaking publicly at a large event, not in private. He turned the screen toward her. This paired with the IP logins and the forged signature paints a story, a very compelling one. Eleanor didn't look away. I'm not going to sue him. Greg blinked. You're not. I don't want a trial. I want timing. I want precision. She leaned forward, hands folded tightly. I want him to believe he's won just long enough to sign something he thinks is his weapon. Greg sat back in his chair, slowly nodding. The rain had lightened to a soft mist against the windows. He tapped the laptop lid closed. You want a trap inside a gift? Eleanor allowed herself a small smile, wrapped in everything he thinks he's entitled to. Greg looked thoughtful, then amused. You're smarter than he deserves. I'm just tired of being quiet. He stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled out a small box of embossed stationery. Then we'll do it properly. I'll send out invitations. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Invitations to a party. Greg said, lips curling at the edge that no one wants to go to. She asked if I still loved her. I didn't know whether to answer as a mother or a woman. The sun hung low behind the thinning branches, casting dappled light across the backyard, where Eleanor had once hosted summer lunches, birthday cakes, and laughter that came easy. Now the air was still, the chairs around the small tea table faded and quiet, as if they too had aged. Eleanor placed 2 teacups on the table. The porcelain one with a fine crack near the handle was hers. The other, a newer floral design, was for Olivia. The back gate creaked open. Olivia stepped through dressed neatly make-up light. Her expression wore an air of civility, but her eyes flickered, restless, guarded. You look tired, Eleanor said softly. I've been busy, Olivia replied, sitting down without removing her coat. They sat for a moment in silence, the kind that stretches between 2 people with too much history and not enough recent warmth. I didn't think you'd come, Eleanor added, pouring the tea. I almost didn't. Olivia's tone was neutral, polite. But Brian said I should hear you out. Eleanor smiled faintly. Brian always was strategic. I came for myself, Olivia corrected quickly, but the way her hands tightened around the teacup told another story. Birdsong filtered in from the neighbour's tree. The scent of rosemary drifted from a pot nearby, one Olivia had planted years ago and forgotten. Eleanor stirred honey into her cup slowly. Your father used to overcook the broccoli. You hated it. Olivia blinked. I still do. He said he'd learn, but he never really did. Eleanor looked out toward the hedge, remembering. That didn't mean he stopped trying. There was a long pause. Olivia looked down at her hands, then back up. Do you think, if someone hurt you, could you still love them? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She reached for the scarf that lay folded on the armrest of her chair, smoothing it between her fingers. Its delicate lace caught the light like spider silk. Love isn't a document, she said eventually. But sometimes documents are how we protect love when it's been misplaced. Olivia said nothing. Eleanor reached under the table and took out a small sealed envelope, its flap pressed closed with a wax stamp. She placed it on the table, not sliding it forward, not inviting curiosity, just letting it sit. If you want to know the whole truth, she said gently, read this. But not today. Olivia stared at the envelope, her lips parting, then closing again. The teacup trembled slightly in her grip. Eleanor stood slowly gathering the empty tray, her motions unrushed. Some things, she said quietly, are better understood when no one is speaking. She turned toward the house, the lace scarf still in her hand, trailing like a ribbon of memory behind her. Sometimes the sharpest trap is the one that looks like a gift. The cafe was warm in the way expensive places often are, soft jazz, humming through unseen speakers, plush chairs, absorbing sound, and golden lighting that made even unease feel civilized. Eleanor sat across from Brian at a corner table tucked behind a tall potted plant. Her scarf lace, as always, rested on her lap, its delicate pattern now familiar to anyone who had been paying attention. Brian arrived on time. Too on time. He slid into the seat with the casual arrogance of someone who believed he was steering the meeting. Greg followed moments later, placing a slim leather folder on the table between them, his tone even. Thank you both for coming. I thought it'd be best to finalize everything in person. Brian leaned forward, smiling. Finally. We've all been waiting on this formality. Greg nodded, taking out a few papers. Right, about that. Eleanor chose not to sign the previous version, so we've made a slight adjustment. Nothing major, just a simplified version. He laid the new document flat, then casually turned his attention to the menu. Coffee for everyone. Brian didn't bother to read the full document. His eyes skimmed the title page, then the bottom, where Greg had placed a red, sticky tab over the signature line. This just says the same thing as before, right? Brian asked. It's just a formality, Greg said without looking up. Brian signed. One stroke, then another. He leaned back in his chair, as if claiming victory, tapping the pen twice, like a gavel of his own making. Greg took the folder, calmly closing it without hurry. Thank you. I'll file this right away. It's important to stay ahead of any misunderstandings. Brian raised an eyebrow. Should I get a copy? Greg smiled as if amused. Of course. In due time. Eleanor hadn't said a word since the meeting began. Now she folded her hands around her teacup and said quietly, You just gave up your right to appeal, if the assets are not divided. Brian turned sharply toward her. What? Greg's voice stayed neutral. Standard clause. It was bolded. Brian reached for the contract, but Greg had already placed it back into the folder. I'd be careful, he said gently. Altering legal documents after signature is frowned upon. Brian's face colored. I thought this was support, not you, assumed, Eleanor said, standing slowly. Her lace scarf trailed across her arm like a ribbon caught in wind. That's always been your greatest strength. And your weakness. Brian opened his mouth, but no sound came. Greg tucked the folder neatly into his briefcase. I'll forward this to the court if necessary. He offered no threat, no smile. Just a professional statement. Brian stared at the table, then at Eleanor. But she was already turning away, the calm of her steps more cutting than any outburst. The waiter, silent all this time, placed the bill in front of Brian with a polite nod. Brian didn't reach for it. Bullies never stop at one blow. They always come back for more. The envelope was thin, but its weight was immense. Eleanor held it against the light of her kitchen window, the pale winter sun struggling to pierce the frosted glass. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a deep old ache she no longer named. Inside, a formal court notice. A request for a psychological competency evaluation initiated by Brian. She laid the paper beside her teacup, the crack along the porcelain now familiar like a scar you learn to live with. Greg's voice over the phone was calm. "Let them try," he said. "The more they push, the more they reveal." The appointment was scheduled for Thursday. Eleanor chose to wear a hand-knitted sweater, grey soft, with a patch of new yarn around the left sleeve. Her son had made it years ago. She had mended it herself. The community clinic was a sterile box, smelling faintly of antiseptic and paper. The receptionist didn't smile, but pointed politely to a seat. Dr. Rowan was sharp-eyed, unsmiling mid-50s, the type who saw through masks but didn't always mention it. Eleanor sat down across from her, hands folded neatly in her lap. Mrs. Whitmore, the doctor, began, "This is a standard cognitive evaluation. Please don't be alarmed." Eleanor gave a slight nod. "I understand." The questions came gently at first. "What year is it, 2025? Who is the current president?" Eleanor answered, her voice steady. Then came the deeper cuts. "Can you tell me about your financial responsibilities? I manage my late husband's estate. I file my own taxes. I review monthly bank statements. I know the interest rates of both our annuities." Dr. Rowan nodded without expression. "Do you recall significant legal events in your life?" "My husband's will was drafted on May 17th, 2017, Eleanor said. "It was signed at Bell and Greaves Law. He left instructions for a staggered inheritance with me as sole executor." The doctor's pen paused briefly, and your daughter Eleanor hesitated, but not long. She was supposed to inherit a third upon reaching 35. That clause was never altered. She married Brian 3 months ago. He has since attempted to access my assets through fabricated consent. Dr. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "You're very clear." "I've had to be," Eleanor replied. "Clarity has been my only defense." There was a silence not uncomfortable, but heavy with recognition. Then the doctor asked, "If your daughter betrayed you, would you resent her?" Eleanor didn't blink. "No," she said softly. "I only regret not teaching her the truth about honesty, that it's a choice, not a trait. One you practice or you lose." Dr. Rowan didn't respond. She simply turned the page and wrote. Eleanor sat still, the sweater warm against her back. Outside, the rain began to tap on the windows, sharp, thin drops that seemed to echo a kind of cleansing. She wasn't afraid of tests. She'd been tested all her life. She opened the envelope and found a mirror. The house was quiet, too quiet for midnight. Olivia sat curled on the corner of the couch, legs tucked beneath her, an untouched cup of chamomile cooling on the coffee table. The envelope stared at her from the cushion beside her, a plain white thing with her name in her mother's script. No flourish, just wait. She picked it up slowly, running a fingertip along the edge. For a moment, she almost placed it back on the table. But then she tore it open. Inside, a folded letter, handwritten, and a smaller slip of paper worn at the edges. She unfolded the larger one first. "Olivia, your father was a man who believed in saving quietly and loving loudly. He never needed applause, just time. You were always his joy. He built this life not to give you luxury, but to give you choices." Her breath caught. He left it all to me not because he doubted you, but because he feared what might happen if someone rushed you into choices you weren't ready to make. A line trembled as her eyes moved down. He didn't leave you money. He left you a mother strong enough to keep it for you. Olivia pressed her hand to her mouth. The light above her dimmed, slightly flickering, or maybe it was her vision. A tear had begun to trace her cheek. Then the small note, her father's handwriting. Angular, precise. Don't let anyone look down on your mother, not even yourself. Her fingers curled around the paper like it was porcelain. She leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling, heart full and breaking at once. Behind her, a door clicked. Brian's voice was low but sharp. "You're still up?" She didn't answer. He walked into the room, noticed the envelope. "What's that?" She turned slowly, the letter still in her lap. "Something I should have read long ago." Brian stepped closer, tone tightening. "Is this about the inheritance again?" She looked at him fully, then eyes rimmed with emotion, but voice clear. "I don't know. If I'm married to a man or a manipulative shadow." His jaw tensed, then shifted into a practiced half smile. "You're tired. Reading too much into old regrets." She didn't reply. Instead, she folded the letter carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "Mum will reveal everything tomorrow," she said. Her voice was no longer shaking. "I hope you don't stop her." He didn't respond, just stared at her, calculating. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling a small object in the mailbox. She would find it tomorrow, the lace scarf tucked neatly inside, still holding warmth that didn't belong to winter. She didn't bring a lawyer. She brought a folded cloth. The morning was still soft when Eleanor stepped into the garden. A faint chill clung to the dew-beaded leaves, and the scent of wet earth curled up from beneath her slippers. She knelt beside the basil bush, pruning with quiet hands. The small shears clicked, steady and patient. Behind her, the gate creaked open. She didn't turn. Footsteps hesitant. A pause. Then Mom. The voice was gentler than it had been in weeks, but Eleanor remained with her back turned, pinching a wilting stem and placing it gently into the wicker basket beside her. "I didn't come to explain," Olivia said, stepping closer. "I don't have the right words. But I brought this." Eleanor rose slowly and turned. Olivia stood near the stone bench, both hands cupped around a folded lace scarf. It was pressed and clean ironed with care. No apology in her voice, but there was weight in the gesture. "I thought it was gone," Eleanor murmured, looking not at the scarf, but at her daughter's eyes. "I told Bethany to throw it away," Olivia said. "She didn't. She hid it in her closet. I found it yesterday." Eleanor stepped forward and reached out not for Olivia's hands, but for the scarf. She took it gently and spread it open on the wooden table between them, its delicate pattern catching the morning light. She didn't smile. "I don't need you to apologize," Eleanor said. "I need you to understand that I'm still here." Olivia looked down. "I don't know what I thought I was protecting, or proving, but it wasn't worth this." There was silence. A robin landed briefly on the garden fence and flew off again. Bethany peeked through the kitchen window, watching but not interrupting. Her small face, framed by the curtain, flickered and vanished as she stepped back. Eleanor sat on the bench, the scarf still open beside her. "Your father planted the rosebush under the maple. It hasn't bloomed since he passed." Olivia followed her gaze. The rosebush was there, shrinking from neglect, but not yet gone. Its thorns looked sharper in the morning light. "If you want to start over," Olivia said, "where do you begin?" Eleanor's eyes softened, but her voice remained calm. From sitting down and replanting the rose bush your father used to take care of. No grand hug, no dramatic forgiveness. Just two women in a quiet garden, one pruning the past, the other learning to hold something fragile without letting it fall again. I wrote it during the worst week of my life, but I never sent it. The wind whispered through the open window, brushing the white curtains into slow motion. Rain pattered gently against the glass, soft but insistent, like a memory trying to be heard. Eleanor sat at the edge of her bed, wrapped in a shawl, the pale yellow light from her bedside lamp casting long shadows across the room. The house was quiet, too quiet for a woman whose life had recently been on trial. She pulled open the drawer of her nightstand and reached inside. Beneath a small photo of Olivia as a toddler and an old grocery list written in her husband's handwriting lay a yellowed envelope. No stamp, no address, just one word written in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Olivia. Eleanor stared at it for a moment before sliding the paper out. The handwriting was hers, but not her heart, not the version of her that existed now. This was a letter born of pain, of being told she was awful, of being accused, ignored, and replaced. I held everything for you, she had written. And still you saw me as a wall to climb over, not a hand to hold. Her eyes moved down the lines, so much of it sharp, too sharp, for the woman she had grown into through silence and survival. You say I don't trust you, but you handed your trust to a man who only sees your value in numbers. She closed her eyes. She remembered writing those words at the kitchen table, the cracked porcelain teacup nearby, the rain hammering the windows. Her hands shaking not from anger, but from the weight of having loved someone who no longer saw her as a lighthouse, only as a rock in the way. She had folded the letter then, but never mailed it. Some truths she had decided only served to wound when spoken aloud. Now years, maybe only months, but lifetimes later she unfolded the old letter and held it over the ceramic tray she used for her evening tea. The match hissed softly, catching fire with a bright, fragile glow. She didn't cry. The flames danced across the page, quickly curling the edges, turning bitterness into ash. When it was done, only soft grey flakes remained like fragile snowfall resting on the tray. A knock at the front door broke the quiet. Eleanor adjusted her shawl and moved slowly down the hallway. When she opened the door, Olivia stood there, her coat damp from rain hair, slightly frizzed, and in her arms a brown bag filled with rose soil. For the bush, Olivia said quietly. I thought we could start today, if it's not too late in the season. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside. As Olivia entered, Eleanor glanced down at the ashes still faintly clinging to her fingers. I was going to send you something, she said, voice calm. But now I think planting flowers would be better. They expected a will. I gave them a garden. The sun filtered through the trees, laying soft gold across the backyard soil. The rosebush had taken root again, its branches trimmed the soil, freshly turned. Eleanor sat beneath the maple tree in a sturdy wooden chair, her back straight, a folded lace scarf resting on her lap. Greg stood nearby, a folder in his hands, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. Olivia sat on the edge of the garden bench, Bethany beside her legs swinging. Brian stood arms crossed, just far enough from the others to pretend detachment. Eleanor looked at no one in particular when she said, We won't be doing this in a courtroom. Not everything has to end with shouting. Greg cleared his throat. This is the final estate plan as requested. No formal will reading, but this is legally binding. He opened the folder. The majority of Eleanor's estate, Greg began, will go to the David Whitmore Foundation for Opportunity, a scholarship fund, in her late husband's name. Brian blinked. Additionally, Greg continued turning a page due to documented ethical violations, including attempts to falsify signatures and manipulate family assets. Brian Whitmore will receive no inheritance. Brian stiffened, but said nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. For Bethany Whitmore, Greg smiled briefly at the girl, a trust fund restricted to education or charitable work. Bethany's eyes widened. Like helping people? Eleanor nodded gently. Exactly. Olivia said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap. Greg moved to the final page. The family home this one will be transferred to Olivia Whitmore, with a condition. Olivia looked up. She must reside here with her mother for no less than 12 consecutive months. If she leaves early, ownership reverts to the foundation. Brian let out a sound that was half scoff, half breath. So now you're bargaining with living arrangements? Eleanor turned to him for the first time. I'm not bargaining, she said. I'm planting. Brian frowned. Planting what exactly? Eleanor's voice was calm. Memory, discipline, presence. The things no court can assign a value to. Brian opened his mouth, then shut it. He turned and left without a word, footsteps fading down the stone path. Greg closed the folder. No applause. No declarations. Just the wind shifting gently through the garden leaves. Eleanor stood, moved to the rosebed and knelt slowly. She reached into the dirt and pulled out the last weed curling at the base of the bush. Then she looked at Olivia and gave a small, quiet nod. Grab a shovel, she said. Olivia rose, hesitated, then moved toward the shed without a word. Bethany leaned closer to her grandmother. What are you planting now? Eleanor smiled softly, brushing soil from her hands. Something that takes time, but lasts longer than money. They took so much from me, but never anything that mattered. The sun cast warm gold over the porch steps, settling gently on the weathered wood and the folded blanket on Eleanor's lap. From the garden came the steady rhythm of a watering can, tipping droplets hitting the soil like soft applause. Olivia stood among the rose bushes, sleeves rolled up, careful not to step on the new sprouts. On the edge of the lawn, Bethany crouched over a patch of dirt, forming small hills and valleys, with her fingers occasionally glancing up to check on her grandmother. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar drifted from the kitchen. Eleanor had risen early to bake the cake, a simple one, nothing extravagant, just the kind her husband used to ask for on Sundays. She'd followed the same recipe she had used the morning of Olivia's wedding, back when things still shimmered with possibility. She rocked gently in her chair, notebook on her lap, pen resting in the spine. Bethany bounded up the steps, cheeks flushed from the sun. "Grandma," she said, holding out her palms dusted in earth. "I made a tiny mountain." Eleanor smiled and reached into the small basket beside her. "I want you to have this," she said, placing a folded lace handkerchief into Bethany's clean hand. Bethany stared at it wide-eyed. "It's so soft." "Did you make this?" "I embroidered it for your mother's wedding," Eleanor said, eyes drifting toward the rose bushes. "But I think it belongs to someone who sees its worth." Bethany nodded solemnly, as if receiving a crown. A few minutes later, Olivia came up the porch steps, balancing a tray with 2 teacups. "I tried to make it how you like," she said softly. Eleanor took a sip stronger than usual, just enough sugar. Her gaze met Olivia's for a breath longer than usual. No apologies, but presence. Sometimes that was more. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the edges of her notebook. Bethany looked up. "Grandma, are you sad about the money, that they tried to take it?" Eleanor laughed gently. Nothing sharp, just an exhale of truth. "Money comes and goes easily, sweetheart. But silence, when it's kept too long or held too tightly, can break a family without a sound." Bethany seemed to think about that for a long time. The lace handkerchief fluttered slightly on her lap. Olivia sat beside them quiet. She didn't reach for the notebook, or the tea, or the scarf. She just sat. And Eleanor, for the first time in a very long time, felt full. Not victorious, not vindicated, just whole. She picked up her pen, opened the notebook, and wrote one final sentence. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted to be remembered with respect. When the roses finally bloomed again in Eleanor's garden, no legal battle had been fought in court, yet the truth stood tall and rooted. The inheritance was never about money, it was about memory, trust, and the courage to protect what matters. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it echoes louder than betrayal ever could. Sometimes reclaiming your name is the most powerful legacy you can leave behind. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.